You're not in danger, not in motion, just in that quiet period before anything begins. The environment is controlled, the air is still. Your senses soften as if you're resting in a secure military zone with engines humming far below. Tonight's tale unfolds with slow precision, guiding your thoughts gently downward. Everything feels distant now, like a base settling into its night cycle. The story ahead drifts in at that same slow rhythm. Let's step into it. I remember the Null Vault most clearly by what it would not allow. Light never pooled there. It smeared. Every lumen we pushed into that hollow around the collapsed star came back thin and colorless, as if the structure itself was drinking it down. The field meters said space was mostly empty, but the empty had a texture, a resistance, like moving through ashes in zero-G. I lay in a medical harness bolted to the bulkhead of a convalescent barge when they told me to start talking. The barge was shackled to the fractured flank of Galloglass, and Galloglass was just one more dead cylinder in the lattice. The vault had let us live, for now. Command wanted a narrative to stitch over the bodies. I was too tired to care how they would use it. The Galloglass was never meant to fight inside something like this. She had been built as a siege hammer, a kilometer-long battle cylinder with a spinal beam array and railgun clusters intended to crack open planetary fortresses and burn through hull plating from light seconds away. When they reassigned me from a station job back to shipboard, I spent the first week tracing her power routing and wondering which bright mind had decided shoving that much weapon into a rotating habitat was a sane idea. At the time, the answer was easy. The vaults had appeared in survey data like knife cuts in the dark. Stable structures around compact remnants, radiating at barely detectable levels, deflecting dust and comets like they were irrelevant. First probes that went in came back with nothing. Second wave didn't come back at all. Third wave managed to skim the inside surface, scrape off readings, and that was enough to start the panic. Transit possibilities, weapons possibilities, existential unknowns. A coalition formed because no single flag could afford to let the others take it alone. We were the hammer at the tip of that coalition. We were the reassurance sold to frightened populations that, if the worst came crawling out of that hollow, we had something ready to meet it. Officially, our mission was to secure and study. Unofficially, we were there to make sure no one else could claim the vault without paying for it in blood. The interior of the Null Vault was a sphere in name only. We entered through an aperture in the lattice like a bullet passing through mesh, drives throttled down to a fraction we would have laughed at during training. The collapsed star sat at the center, a dim ruin flickering under layers of field distortions. The lattice nodes glowed fitfully on sensors, huge geometric bones in the dark, their true geometry barely interpretable by our software. Emission caps were the first command directive. We ran cold. Thermal budgets were thinner than what a freighter would use on idle. Weapons tracking ran on narrow whisper beams. Every watt had to justify itself because no one knew what would tip the vault from tolerant to lethal. I watched the first Null Scar form a week after we arrived. A frigate from the Eastern Bloc misjudged its burn while adjusting position in the inner shell. To anyone in a normal theater, the burn would have looked cautious. Here, the acceleration spike crossed whatever threshold the vault cared about. Sensors saw a momentary flare. Then the frigate flashed a gap in its hull the size of a city block. There was no explosion, no spray of fragments. The section was simply not there anymore. One heartbeat, they had an engine cluster and crew quarters and shielded comms. The next heartbeat, those coordinates were vacuum and sheared metal, edges so clean they made you doubt your own eyes. Inside what remained, atmosphere took care of the rest. People died in the quiet way they do when pressure stops. We cataloged the phenomena, ran models, adjusted our thresholds further down. It was easy to call it a glitch, a local anomaly, until it happened again on a different ship for a different reason. A stray test pulse from a beam battery, half power, no target. The vault erased the weapon deck and a swath of space beside it. No secondary effects, no debris, just absence. That was when the Admiral changed. Admiral Ree had been selected because she understood both politics and kill chains. She spoke fluently about proportional response and escalation ladders. I had seen her in briefings before the vault, calm voice selling the public on shared stewardship of alien wonders. After the second null strike, some layer of her peeled away. All that remained was the certainty that we had stumbled into a loaded trap. Her orders shifted from cautious study to preemptive control. Communications to the coalition grew clipped. She spoke less about learning and more about denying. The vault was no longer something to manage, it was something to neutralize before it turned on us in full. When the third null event happened, it took my legs. We were at low spin, adjusting the drum to align engineering with the inner lattice for a better sensor line. I was in a crawl, halfway between a bypass panel and a junction node, one hand on the bulkhead, one hand on a cable clamp, weight almost nothing in the lazy roll. Someone in a command bay fired a test discharge from one of the outer ships, lower than before, they swore, within the safe envelope. The vault disagreed. My world turned white and wrong. I did not feel heat. I did not hear noise. There was no shockwave, no blow. One instant my body existed from chest down, harness clustered over my hips, modal implants in my thighs humming. The next instant, there was nothing below my lower ribs but a gap. I did not see it. The mind edits when it must. I saw an edge in my peripheral vision, metal sheared at a knife angle, wires hanging like roots. My fingers were around a clamp and tingling. The rest was an absence full of cold air. I remember trying to move my foot and feeling the reflex go into a void where my nerves used to be. Later, they told me the vault had carved a plane through that section of the drum, erasing a corridor, a third of a tank cluster, a dozen people. The field had licked through me and taken what it wanted. No explosion, just subtraction. Medics found me pinned by my harness, floating inches above nothing. They clamped tourniquets where anatomy textbooks don't bother to draw lines. They forced synth stasis into veins that no longer had a path. They hauled me out while the drum kept turning, while the Admiral's voice echoed over the intercoms, ordering stand-downs, damage reports, silence. Silence was all I heard for a long time. They rebuilt what they could. The lower half of my spine became a scaffold of alloys and printed cartilage. Interfaces threaded through my flesh, docking to an exoframe that made up the difference between a functioning body and a torso strapped to a pallet. Pain was constant at first, then less constant, then an ambient static I could no longer imagine living without. Sleep came in narcotic drops, never for long. From the med bay, I watched the Admiral take us to war with the structure that had maimed me without malice. She called it preemption. If the vault could carve us apart at thresholds we barely understood, then leaving it intact was an unacceptable risk. Her plan was simple in theory: charge the spinal grid to full, focus the main beam through a calculated node in the lattice, and punch a hole large enough to destabilize the central field. According to the models, the resulting collapse would either destroy the vault or render it inert. According to the models, the vault would not tolerate that attempt either. Command channels filled with protest. Other captains warned her that any such overcharge could trigger a global null event. Some begged, some threatened. A few quietly signaled agreement, tired of floating behind a loaded weapon pointed at their home systems. I listened to it through the medbay feeds and felt nothing but a distant, professional dread. Emotion had drained out somewhere between the clamps and the surgery. All that remained was a list of causes and effects. The Admiral declared martial law aboard Gallowglass when the first captain refused to align their ship in support. Security detachments swept the drum, confiscating sidearms, locking down armories, isolating anyone who had spoken against the overcharge. She called them saboteurs, cowards, traitors to their species. The chief of internal security resigned rather than lead those sweeps. I was still strapped to my harness when they calmed me and offered the role to the broken engineer who could not walk. They did not need me to run, only to know the guts of the ship. I accepted, not because I believed in the Admiral's plan, but because I knew her loyalists would tear the ship apart in their zeal if no one who understood the systems was there to limit the damage. The exoframe came next. Conveyors carried me to a bay where technicians craned a skeletal rig in from storage. The frame locked to my spine ports with a pain that stripped the world down to bright noise. When color returned, my limbs had weight again. Artificial muscles whispered as they responded to my intent. I stood on mechanical legs that could crush a man's ribs and felt every gram of the metal like a sin. From then on, I lived strapped into a walking machine, guiding other armed machines through a ship that no longer trusted itself. We moved carefully. Energy budgets were still capped. Armor servos were tuned down to keep from tripping the Vault's wrath. Rail weapons were cold. We carried chemical slug throwers and blade tools instead, laughing quietly at how wars dragged old techniques back when new ones became risky. It did not take long for resistance to show itself. Engineers refused reroute orders that bypassed safeties. Reactor techs dragged out procedures, citing non-existent calibration checks. A medical team refused to surrender a life support node to be cannibalized for charging capacitors. At first, the Admiral ordered arrests. When that did not bring compliance fast enough, she ordered executions. Procedural, she called them. Necessary discipline in an environment where hesitation could doom millions. I watched through helmet feeds as a sergeant I knew put 3 rounds into the head of a man who had taught me thermal management when I was an apprentice. The man's blood drifted in a slow arc in the low spin, droplets catching the emergency lights. No null strike came. The Vault did not care about bullets. It cared only about thresholds. That difference mattered to some of us. It did not matter to the Admiral at all. The resistance changed shape after that. Direct refusal became sabotage. Someone undermined the charge sequence in a capacitor bank, triggering a controlled bleed instead of a full load. Someone else bricked a guidance cluster. A supply shuttle misrouted crates. Heavy armor suits turned up missing from lockers. My own crews lost coils and regulators that would have fed the main grid. We played a slow game against our own command, trying to stretch time until someone outside the Vault found a way to pull us back, or until the Admiral's nerve cracked under the pressure. The Vault did not wait. We had a timetable for the overcharge. The Admiral pushed hard toward it. Every delay we introduced increased her paranoia. She started moving her own loyalists into key bays. She slept on the command deck, flanked by aides who watched each other. Then, a ship on the far side of the hollow snapped. A patrol cruiser, jittery from weeks under restricted power, fired a rail salvo at an echo on its scopes. Maybe it was a shadow, maybe a sensor ghost, maybe a genuine contact we will never identify. The salvo was low power compared to what the guns were designed for. In any normal space, it would have been a warning shot. Here, it crossed the line. From our vantage point, the event had no sound. Sensors saw a transient surge of field distortion from the Vault's nodes, like muscles tensing. The space between the cruiser and its phantom target turned black, not with shadows, but with lack. The rails, the slugs, the gun mounts, the crew behind them, the armor around them, the corridor leading away. All of it vanished in a configuration that made no geometric sense. Not torn, not burned, just replaced with a cutout of void. Our data feeds filled with dead channels and error codes. Shocks propagated along the cruiser's frame as compartments lost integrity. Bodies and cargo spilled into the gap and froze. The Vault was not just trimming, it was pruning. The Admiral called it confirmation, proof that the structure was ready to strike first chance it got. She moved the timetable up. No more delays, no more negotiations with other captains. The charge sequence would begin within hours. At that point, resistance stopped being about conscience. It became survival. We had rough models of what a full beam discharge would look like inside the Vault. Even at low coupling efficiency, the energy would dwarf any previous threshold violation. Either the beam would tear open something in the lattice that we could not predict, or the Vault would respond with a global nullification event. The equations did not leave room for a benign outcome. I gathered the few people left who still answered my calls without logging them to command. Engineers, med techs, a couple of gunners who had lost families in the Null scars, some security troopers who followed me out of habit more than conviction. We did not speak in the med bay. We flashed plans through local meshes and ports, coded our intent into routing changes, maintenance orders, medical transfers. The plan that formed was ugly and simple. We would cut the spinal grid at key choke points and force a ship-wide power cascade that dragged every active system below the Vault's threshold. If we did it right, the beam could not fire and the Vault might recognize the submission as sufficient. If we did it wrong, we would die a few minutes before everyone else did. The Admiral was not blind. She anticipated resistance in engineering and locked down access routes, posted her best armored teams at the junctions. She ordered the drum's rotation halted for alignment, converting the habitat spin into a straight-line corridor from the forward decks to the aft grid. I felt the world slow as massive flywheels bled off momentum. The floor under my exo-frame shuddered. People stumbled in corridors calibrated for constant spin. Loose equipment floated, then drifted toward new vectors. The Admiral was turning the ship into a gun barrel in more ways than one. Our chance lay in the transition. While gravity faded, we moved. I led from a node bay 3 decks off the central spine. I was wired into consoles, exo-frame anchored to support rails. My teams moved through service shafts and elevator trunks that had never been intended for combat. We used passive optics and low-power tags, whispering our way past seals that had not been cycled in years. Loyalist squads in armor advanced along the main corridors toward engineering. Their suit cams fed into the command net. Their presence glowed on our tactical overlay like cold suns. They moved with trained precision. The Vault did not care about them. Their weapons were chemical, their servos restrained. They were within permissible energy budgets. We were not concerned with them yet. Our first targets were the conduits. I issued cut orders to 3 teams at once. One was in a crawl space above the main capacitor gallery, another clinging to the outside of a coolant pipe, the third in a closet masquerading as a sensor hub. They carried charges calibrated to fracture bus bars without spraying shrapnel. They knew that if they miscalculated, a flash could pull the Vault's attention. We had rehearsed it in sim. The real thing was slower, messier, but close enough. The first charge fired like a heavy fist into the bones of the ship. I felt the vibration come up through the frame into my spine ports. Sensors showed a branch of the grid flicker, then die. The second charge lagged by a heartbeat, then the third. Power flows reconfigured around the brakes, compensating, but we had expected that. Our map updated. New choke points lit up like arteries. That was when the Admiral's teams reached engineering. The fight there was short and grotesque. I watched it through grainy feeds that cut out in bursts as lines went down. Loyalists in armor pushing into a room full of tired techs with tools instead of guns. A wrench swung, a rifle butt answering. A misaimed rifle discharged at point blank into a console. Sparks arced higher than they should have. For an instant, local fields spiked. The Vault noticed. The nullification strike took a strip out of the engineering deck and 3 meters of ship around it. In the feed's last frames, I saw half of a Loyalist's armored torso hanging in midair, upper body and head simply gone. The cut grazed a coolant main. Atomized coolant flashed into ice crystals and then into nothing as the field brushed past. The feed died. Sensor overlays updated. Gallowglass was now lighter by mass we did not dare calculate. We lost most of my first wave there. Some to bullets, some to the Vault's scalpel. Names scrolled in the casualty buffer. I cleared the buffer. There was no room left in my head for individual ghosts. The Admiral interpreted the strike as another proof of the Vault's hostility. She screamed at surviving captains to hold their positions. She doubled her guards around the remaining grid access points. She forced engineering control to reroute through the command deck, centralizing her grip. That centralization was a gift. If you feed too many functions through one node, it becomes a single point of failure. Our revised plan depended on that. While my remaining teams repositioned, I ordered one squad, just 3 people in light suits, to take a tool sled and ride the shaft of a maintenance elevator into the gap between drum sections. With spin nearly 0, the shaft had become a tunnel aiming straight at the core of the ship, lined with cables and manual ladders. The sled's small thrusters pushed them along at a crawl. They carried a single capacitor-killing charge, a coil of bus cable, and a pair of thermal cutters. Their job was to wire a manual kill into the main bus that fed the command deck. Mine was to keep the Admiral's armored wolves occupied elsewhere. I sent myself to meet them. The barge's medtechs argued when I requested transfer. I ignored them. The exo-frame was clumsy in confined spaces, but it had mass and built-in stabilization. I hooked into a service car and rode it along the outside of the drum, footing clamping and releasing on the hull's mag rails in a stuttering rhythm. The interior of the vault hung around us, the collapsed star, a small, sick light in the distance, the lattice nodes barely visible as ghost geometry against the darkness. Beams from other ships traced thin lines across the hollow, power budgets so low they barely qualified as light. Your brain kept expecting something bigger to blaze up, a missile plume, a main drive flare, anything familiar. Instead, there was only restraint and the memory of what happened when that restraint slipped. I reached an airlock 2 decks below the command deck and cycled in. The corridors there had been scrubbed clean by fear. No graffiti, no discarded gear, no lingering conversations. The Admiral's people patrolled them in pairs, suit visors mirrored, rifles locked to their chests. I moved like any other armored figure, exoframe humming softly, ident tags broadcasting the right credentials. They saw the rank marker, the engineer overlay, the spidery medical signatures in my vitals. They stepped aside. That was the war reduced to its simplest form, a contest between what looked official and what actually kept you alive. In a junction node near the underside of the command deck, I anchored my frame and plugged into the trunk lines. From there, I could see the grid's heart. Power flowed up from the reactors, along conduits that had been rerouted half a dozen times in the last month, converging on the capacitors that would feed the beam array. The Admiral had already started charging them, slow and steady, pushing their levels just under the vault's earlier thresholds. She thought that by crawling up to power drip by drip, she could fool the structure that had carved me in half in a microsecond. It would have been funny if it weren't so lethal. I watched levels climb and sent silent acknowledgments to my squad in the elevator shaft. They were almost at their destination. When they arrived, they would cut into the main bus, splice in the kill line, and wait for my signal. On that signal, they would short the capacitors out through sacrificial loads and dump the ship's main grid into darkness. It would not be clean. Components would vaporize, conduits would arc, people near the wrong panels would die. But the spike would be sharp and internal, the kind of event we hoped the vault's sensors would interpret as a ship's self-termination, not a threat against it. Loyalist movement markers shifted on my overlay. The Admiral had sensed the pattern, even without specifics. She dispatched her heavy suits down toward engineering again, intent on crushing any remaining resistance before the charge completed. Her move intersected our elevator shaft. They reached the shaft just as my squad reached the bus. What followed was the kind of fight you only get when gravity is in dispute and both sides are terrified of making noise. Armored suits clung to ladder rungs with mag clamps, their mass turning each movement into a slow pendulum. My squad clung to cable bundles and the hull, suits orange on my overlay, enemy suits blue. They fired sparingly, single shots, careful volleys. Each one of those shots represented a little piece of the emission budget. Each muzzle flash made my throat go tight, waiting for the vault's invisible blade. The vault did not strike. The shots stayed below its notice. The suits that took them did not. Armor cracked. Limbs tumbled. One of my squad took a slug through the chest and spun away, tumbling along the shaft, blood and insulation trailing in a thin mist. The survivors reached the bus. They anchored themselves with emergency bolts and set the charge. I watched their suit cams paint targeting outlines on the bus casings, marking the grains of the metal like a surgeon's marks. The cutters burned for a few seconds, careful arcs in the thin air. A hole opened, bright with the hum of contained energy. The Admiral's team bore down on them. I felt power levels creep higher. The beam capacitors were in their final charge window. The Admiral's voice cut across internal channels, ordering all non-essential personnel to stand clear of structural conduits. She was trusting the grid to do what it had been built to do, take energy and give it shape. We were going to break that trust. My squad called in ready. Their breaths were the only sound on the line. I gave the signal. The charge detonated inside the bus. In the instant before our sensors overloaded, I saw the energy flow revector. The path that had been climbing obediently toward the beam array jumped sideways, seeking a new path through the low-resistance kill line we had spliced. The grid bucked. In my node, every console screamed. Lights in the corridor went dark, then flared, then went out again. My exoframe servos cut to default, leaving me hanging on locked joints. More important, the capacitors discharged into dead metal and sacrifice banks instead of the spinal array. Arcs leapt across support struts. Casings vaporized, filling compartments with metal fog. People nearby were cooked where they stood. The vault reacted, but not with a blade. Instead of a surgical null plane, sensors recorded a broad, low-intensity shift in the fields, like a pressure change. For a moment, it felt exactly like the pause between breath and exhale. Then the ambient emissions across the interior hollow dropped. Not just from Galloglass, from every ship. Other captains had been watching. When they saw our signature vanish instead of spike, they made their own choices. Reactors went to idle. Drives died. Weapons that had been covertly charging in other hulls suddenly showed zero. It was as if a flock had folded its wings all at once. Only the Admiral resisted. On the command deck above me, emergency power flickered on. Her staff scrambled to restore control. My interface showed her forcing manual overrides, jury-rigging alternate pathways, trying to route what remained of the grid through surviving conduits. She had lost her main hammer, but she still wanted to swing. I pulled my frame free of the dead node and began climbing. The corridors toward the command deck were a mess of smoke and floating debris. With spin almost gone, everything that had not been bolted down had become a hazard. A body in security armor drifted past, visor cracked, eyes open to nothing. I pushed it aside with one servo hand and kept moving. At the hatch to the command deck, I found loyalists trying to cut their way through from the inside. The blast doors had failed in some half-closed configuration and warped under their own weight when the grid collapsed. I anchored, locked my frame, and fed a manual override into the hatch's mechanism. Old gears groaned. The door opened just enough for me to squeeze through. The command deck was lit only by backup strips. Consoles glowed weakly, their interfaces stripped down to bare essentials. The Admiral stood in the center, one hand on a dead control pillar, the other braced against a railing. Half her staff lay on the floor, some conscious, some not. A few were clearly corpses, unmarked but still. She looked smaller than in any briefing I had ever seen. She saw me and reached for a sidearm that wasn't there. Somewhere in the chaos, she had lost it. Her lips moved, shaping words I will not repeat, promises and threats and justifications for the dead whose names I no longer recited even to myself. I did not answer. Our orders forbade speech in the vault except when strictly needed. Sound was wasted air. Besides, there was nothing left that language could fix. Instead, I went to the remaining power pillar and fed my exo frame into its ports. The grid map was unrecognizable. Lines I had spent months learning were gone. New ones flickered at the edge of coherence. The Admiral's last attempts to push energy into the array had blown fuses across half the ship. We had no clean path to anything that could be called weaponry. What remained was life support and minimal attitude control. I took those, and I shut them down. For a breathless moment, Galloglass was a corpse. No drives, no beams, no fields beyond what the vault itself allowed. Inside that corpse, people floated in the dark, tethered only by their suit seals and hands. The Admiral sagged against the railing, realization finally reaching through whatever armor she had built in her mind. Her ship was gone. Her plan was gone. All that remained was the structure she had tried to kill and the hundreds of thousands of lives hanging in its hollow. Across the vault, other ships followed our pattern. Their signatures winked out on my diminished board, one after another, until the interior was as close to dark as human technology could make it. The vault responded. Out in the hollow, the lattice nodes brightened. Not to weapon levels, not to anything like what we would have called an attack. They glowed in a spectrum, our eyes translated into a dirty blue. Field lines reoriented. The collapsed star's distortions shifted. The whole structure flexed. New apertures opened in the lattice-like irises. They did not face us. They faced outward, away from the star, toward places that had not existed in our maps before. Gates by any other name. Connections tunneled through nothing to destinations we had no way to identify. Power came back, but not because we turned anything on. The vault draped a low-level field through the hollow, enough to keep functions like atmosphere cycling and minimal heat management alive. Our reactors remained cold, our drives silent. The message was not in words, but it was clear enough for anyone who had watched it cut people apart. We had thrown down our weapons. It had chosen not to finish us. It had opened doors instead. The Admiral did not survive the days that followed. Internal inquiry said she died of injuries sustained during the grid collapse. There was no video. It did not matter. Her absence did not change the fact that the Coalition was now trapped inside a structure that had given us a choice we did not know how to answer. We sent probes through the new apertures on the lowest possible power settings. Some came back, some did not. The ones that returned brought images of star fields we could not place, planets with ice rings, voids between galaxies. The Vault's web reached far beyond our quarrels. Command argued about what to do with that. Use it as a transit hub, seal it, flee, claim it. No consensus emerged. In the meantime, the wounded needed care, hulls needed patching, dead needed cataloging. They moved me to the convalescent barge when my spine port stabilized. The barge was little more than a pressure shell and a pulse of borrowed atmosphere. It had no drives, only tethers to galloglass, which itself drifted under the Vault's imposed stability. From my harness, I could see the lattice through a porthole when the med techs forgot to close the shutter. The collapsed star looked smaller with each passing day. It was not, of course. The mind plays tricks when you stare at the same wound in space too long. The star stayed the same. The Vault stayed the same. We were the ones shrinking, stripped of pretense, reduced to a cluster of damaged organisms suspended in an alien device that had not been built to notice us at all. They asked me once if I thought our resistance had mattered, whether forcing the grid collapse had actually changed the Vault's response, or whether it had always intended to open the gates and had just been waiting for us to stop stabbing at it with sharpened sticks. I told him the truth. I did not know. What I knew was the texture of the edge that took my legs, the way metal looked when it ended in a plane thinner than atoms, the way blood behaved in the low spin a second before freezing and sublimating into nothing, the feel of my frame's legs locking when the grid went dark, the silence of systems dying in the name of something like mercy. Those were real. The rest was conjecture. At night, such as it is in a place defined mostly by absence, I sometimes feel the Vault watching, not with malice, not with interest, just with the casual, crushing indifference of a tool waiting to be used again. Somewhere in its lattice, fields hum at levels we barely understand. Somewhere beyond those new apertures, other civilizations may have learned its thresholds long before us, or died failing to. Our role in that story is a footnote. I replay the sequence in my head anyway. The cautious entry. The first, null scar. The second, the moment when half my body stopped existing. The Admiral's resolve hardening into fanaticism. The slow, grinding push through corridors, not to win a war, but to keep it from spilling into something larger than itself. I tell myself that it mattered to the people who did not die in the beam that never fired. It might not matter to history. It certainly does not matter to the Vault. But when I close my eyes, I see a ship going dark in a hollow full of faint, cold stars, and I feel, for just a heartbeat, something like relief, not hope. Hope belongs to people who still believe they can shape what comes next. This was simpler. We stopped making it worse. The end. The narrative settles, and the world returns to a fortified, peaceful quiet. You're in the safest part of the night now. Let sleep take over.